So, Mr Speaker, it's my pleasure to take a brief call on this bill, and I look forward to talking about it in the next readings.
I understand the next call is a split call. I'll ring the bell at 4 minutes. The Honourable Phil Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I'm very conscious of the circumstances under which the legislation that we're looking at now was passed in 2005. I was the Minister in charge of that bill. So the circumstances at that point were basically that in 1998, under the then National Government, behaviour modification regime or management regime was put in place that was kept in that form through to 2004, when it was found that this regime was not operating as the governments that initiated it and continued it intended, but was in fact operating in breach of basic rights that New Zealand as a nation had signed up to internationally. And nobody in this House, I would hope, would suggest that a state, when it has control over an inmate, however heinous the crime that that inmate might have committed, should not work under its own rules and work under the rule of law. What worried me at the time, when a very large case was brought, a class action that might have involved considerable sums of money, was that these people who had committed particularly terrible crimes would get compensation for the abuse of their rights, but their victims in turn, who had suffered and still carried the scars of the offending against them by this particular group of people, would still be outside with no compensation at all for the actions, the crimes that were committed against them by the offenders. And that seemed to me fundamentally wrong. Mr Chairman, as Minister of Justice, and since that time, I've always felt that the principles of restorative justice are really important. That to the extent possible, an offender should try to right the wrongs committed against the victim. That actually achieves justice. In our current justice system, we don't often do that. We have the state against the offender, and the victim is to one side. The victim almost doesn't matter. And to me, it seems that the victim needs to be at the heart of the process. And we weren't sure that this legislation was long-term going to be the most appropriate form of legislation that we needed. And that's why we put the sunset clause into it. And I have to comment, Mr Speaker, that it's unfortunate that we're sitting here 10 days, less than 10 days before the legislation expires, to carry on the legislation for another year because the government didn't get its act together, despite 3.5 years' notice of this, by putting in place replacement legislation. But we will support this legislation because we want a new regime in place that really will work on behalf of the victims. And that should be the focus of the review, and it should be the focus of replacement legislation. And I think, Mr Chairman, Mr Speaker, what we need to do is think more laterally than what was the case in this legislation and in the proposed legislation from the government. You know, where any offender receives a windfall payment, they might actually win lotto. They might come into a big inheritance. At the time they were convicted of the offence against the victim, they had no money and the victim got no restitution, no reparation. If subsequently the offender is able to make good the wrong that they committed for the victim, why don't we think about broadening legislation so that in any case where an offender has badly damaged a victim and made no compensation, no reparation, no restitution, they should be required to make good the wrong that they have done to the victim. Let's not just restrict this to the inmate, Mr Speaker, who was in the prison. That's taking one small category of those who offended and leaves the vast majority of the victims uncompensated for by the offender. If we truly believe in a form of restorative justice, why don't we think more widely, and why don't we come up with a compensation scheme that allows, even some considerable time after the offence was committed, an offender now placed in the position to do so to put things right for the victim. I'm conscious under the existing legislation there are only 5 cases where the victims got compensation, totalling about $45,000. that's a drop in the bucket. Let's use this period of time of a year to think more laterally and to come up with something that truly does put the victim at the heart of a justice system.
I called Julie.